I deceived you. I played you false, I admit that. But she was to blame. It was her fault. She done us both. If you can find it in your heart, sir. Give me another chance.
Hey guys, thanks for joining me again. Today we're talking about an interesting film called The Seven, which is a UK it's a UK film directed by Joseph Losey, and it's become like a classic over time. It's a very strange, different kind of a film, in a very subtle way. Let me explain. So Tony, played by James Fox, is an upper class kind of a guy, and he has a flat in London, so he hires a guy called Barrett, played by Dirk, Bogarde, to be his like valet. So that's somebody who kind of is like your personal servant, I guess. So yeah, I think some people have seen this film and been like, oh, it's his butler. It's actually not. He's a valet, so it's more like a personal, somebody that does slightly more personal jobs. But Tony just sort of expects Barrett to do everything. So Tony's kind of an arrogant, foolish kind of guy, and Barrett slowly kind of makes moves to put him under his thumb and reverses the role of master and servant. So that's kind of like the through line of the film. Tony is played by James Fox, who he's in the new Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the new Sherlock Holmes, so he's kind of like still doing things. You might see him and be like, oh, he's that guy. And Dirk Bogarde, Bridge Too Far, those like Doctor movies, if you guys remember those. And then Tony's fiance Susan is Wendy Craig. So she was from a series called Butterflies. It's a BBC series. And Sarah Miles plays Vera. She's from Blow Up, and I think she won an Oscar for Ryan's Daughter. So none of those are films that we've talked about here, but that's kind of their background. So The Servant is kind of a sort of a subtle film at first. It comes directly out of the changing times of the 50s and 60s. So most people, maybe not most people, but people used to have servants in the UK. It was really, really common. You'd have a maid or a valet if you were sort of middle to upper class. But after the Second World War, it was really hard for people to, like, people don't want to be servants anymore, you know? And why would they? You generally, sometimes you were treated well, and taken care of and had sort of like a home for life and whatever, but often the demands made upon you were just, you were expected to not have a life outside of the home. And that sometimes the pay was good, but sometimes you'd be expected to do things that were just sort of, you know, now you would be able to say like, that's outside my pay grade, you know. You couldn't back then. And in some cases people were not allowed to get married, and all kinds of things. So people just wanted more than one day off a week and being pushed around and maybe not really treated very well. So this film kind of looks at a period of time where some people still wanted to have servants, but it was also hard to find people who were trained properly in service and who were willing to still have those old working conditions. So if you read books written by British people, especially women, I think, like women authors, because they're more aware of the domestic sphere, there's a lot of talk about, you know, difficulty with this, and people having different expectations and wanting more of a life, and like the idea of being a maid or a servant. You know, it used to be that that was considered to be a very good job because it was a job for life and there was security in it and stuff. And you could even, some people considered servants to be part of the family. That's very best case scenario, but so in this time, some people still wanted a personal valet, but you were unlikely to find someone who would fill that position. And it created like an uneasiness, because that sense of control was changing. Back in the day, you know, your servants wouldn't answer back, or you could fire them on the spot and make sure they never worked again, which could ruin their lives, you know. So like, if you had a servant, you were sort of in control. Whereas in this film, you kind of see people have much more options. They don't have to be in service. Being in service isn't necessarily like a good job or a good career option. So there's this creeping unease of like, you have a stranger in your house. And there's also in this film, there used to be these books called Jeeves and Wooster, and there was a really good TV series adaptation, and these were comedies. So Bertie Wooster was somebody who was just, he couldn't survive on his own, and he's just foolish, and it kind of makes fun of him, but also makes fun of the servant class, because Jeeves is his sort of valet and butler, and just basically just saves his life in every book in some way. Like, he stops him from having to marry someone who's unsuitable, or, you know, it's all very comedic, and it kind of makes fun of the dependency of that upper class, and also the kind of subtle superiority of Jeeves over Wooster, even though Jeeves is not sinister. So this movie kind of plays with that idea. Tony is this kind of feckless character, but he's a little bit more, there's a kind of subversive darkness to this. So Tony is not a nice guy. He doesn't have the charm of a Bertie Wooster. He doesn't have like the kindness. Where Wooster is maybe like funny because he has no idea, this movie kind of shows you like, it's not funny, it's unkind, it's self-absorbed. So yeah, Tony talks down to people, and just kind of generally thinks he's better than everybody, and he's pretty awful, basically. He's not very nice to his fiance, really. He's very selfish, and I think that's kind of a good thing, because in this film, it kind of adds this sense of whose side are you on. Like, you don't really feel that sorry for Tony because he's not that nice, but at the same time, Dirk Bogarde as Barrett is like incredibly sinister. So Barrett starts off quite restrained, and he just does little things. Like, there's a thing with a vase where he just kind of puts the vase where he wants it to go, and Tony's fiance Susan kind of has this battle. She doesn't like Barrett, and she senses that he's taking advantage more and more, and she kind of tries to push Barrett out, and in response, Barrett kind of pushes her out, which is kind of interesting. So at a certain point, Barrett moves. He says that his sister will come in and work as a maid because there's too much work for him to do on his own. But Vera, the maid, is actually his girlfriend, and he sets her up to seduce Tony to kind of ruin his life, but also so that he has like a blackmail chip. And it's kind of interesting because it adds to this strange mood of like, I don't know, Vera seems very kind of innocent and bubbly, and I don't know, like she just seems like a little cute little bumblebee, but she's trapped in this web that this spider has kind of made. And she's so disposable to them because the sort of war here is between Barrett and Tony. So I feel like the women are like important characters, but they're sort of superfluous to these two guys. Yeah, and they kind of both just discard her at a certain point. Like, that's not a major spoiler, but it kind of made me feel sad because I think she was just a pawn to both of them. They're both pretty horrible people. Yeah, so I think Bogarde's performance in this just really makes this film because he's so, I don't know, there's just kind of something a bit thuggish about him. And it's always kind of restrained behind this veneer of sort of servitude, or it's not, towards the end it shifts, but you just know there's something wrong with this guy. So that's kind of like the groundwork of the film, but I think some of the eeriness of like the hauntingness of this film comes from the kind of sexuality of the whole thing. So there's towards the start, there's a scene where Tony and Susan are about to kind of they're kind of fooling around on the couch, and Susan realizes Barrett's like basically watching them, and it makes her really uncomfortable for obvious reasons. And Tony kind of defends Barrett, so it's like this weird dynamic that he's kind of stepping into. Also that Vera is Barrett's girlfriend, but then sleeps with Tony. There's like this kind of sexual link between the three of them. But it's other things too. There's a scene where Vera and Barrett are like upstairs, and they're obviously kind of having sex, and you just see Bogarde knows that Tony's come home, and you can just see his like shadow on the wall and that he's naked, and it's like he just stands there, like, you know what I mean? It's kind of this weird, like, he knows that Tony knows, you know, it's kind of this, you just know there's something going on, but maybe you're not 100% sure or something, you know? Tony also, there's a moment where Tony goes upstairs to his room and he has all these like pictures of like guys on his wall, so it's like implied that maybe he's bisexual or gay and that there's something going on, but it doesn't kind of go further than that, which kind of means, I mean, it probably, maybe with the 60s it couldn't go further, I'm not sure, but it adds to this strange thing where you're not sure what Barrett has over Tony. Later in the film they kind of bicker like a married couple as well, so it's kind of interesting that the slow shift over the course of the film where like there's a power shift where Tony kind of doesn't really take command of the situation, but when he tries to, it kind of backfires and Barrett has even more control. There's a really, really great scene in this movie as well where Tony's sort of been drinking more and more, and he's kind of a little bit under the thumb, and they're playing hide and seek. So Tony goes and hides in the shower, and Barrett's looking for him, and it stops being like a hide and seek game. It starts being like some weird like hunting scene, and it's kind of really slow and creepy. Like you just think, is he gonna murder him or something? Like, and the horror on Tony's face, it's just kind of really interesting. Like everything's kind of unsaid in that moment. So I think this film kind of reflects some of those fears of, you know, the upper class maybe not really being as in control as they should be, or not being very responsible, or even being dissipated in some way. And also the fear of like, what if you bring someone into your house and then they use their place in your home like against you, you know? It's kind of an interesting, it's just kind of an interesting cultural thing, I guess. So I think one of the good things that Bogarde does is like there's a scene where he goes to make a phone call and he's really sinister and really kind of plays up his accent. And so he's so different outside of that house than he is inside the house. Yeah, and I think the style of this film, whilst there's kind of this homoerotic undertone and this eeriness, it's almost shot like a horror movie. So it's like a drama, but with kind of horror visuals. You see it especially in that scene where he's kind of, they're playing hide and seek and it turns into a hunt. There's also a song that kind of is a theme throughout this movie that plays a lot, and it's kind of Tony's song for Susan, but part of the way through you kind of wonder if it is. And the words are kind of nonsensy words, and it becomes, the more it plays, the more eerie it is, and it's pretty much one of the only sort of soundtrack that there is in this film. So it starts to kind of get on your nerves in this repetitious way. So that's essentially the film. I think the ending is something that I didn't really like. I think now, if you sort of made a film like this now, it could be much more, the meaning could be a bit more explicit. So Tony basically becomes worse and worse and less effectual. Barrett gets more and more power, and I think by the end Barrett's kind of in control, but I think he's kind of got a hold of Tony's money somehow. And he just sort of says like they're going to Brazil, and I'm like, I don't really understand what that implication is. Like, if there's something that Brazil meant to people in the 60s, like maybe they can be like a couple there, or like I don't really know. So the final kind of scenes, bit of a spoiler here, is Susan goes to the house and she kind of sees how much Tony is degenerated and that kind of thing, and there's like a party going on, and I just was a bit confused because I was like unsure who the women were at the party, who they were there for. I kind of got the impression that maybe Barrett was kind of like pimping Tony or something. So I think that like ambiguous ending was a little lost on me personally. And I think it just felt like a very soft kind of ending, but essentially, over the course of the film, these roles switch, and that's kind of the point of the film. So this book was actually based on like a novella by Robin Maugham. He's the nephew of Somerset Maugham, if I'm pronouncing that right, and he was pretty open about being gay and his homosexuality, which was I think it's pretty brave for the time period. So this film is in trying to hide the homoerotic kind of nature. It's also was adapted by Harold Pinter into a screenplay. So, I don't know, it's quite kind of well written, and it has like a nice evenness of pace, which I think is important with switching roles like that it doesn't always kind of happen too fast. So I think it's a really interesting one. It's not one, I remember hearing a lot about this film, but I'd never seen it before. So I really like the way it's kind of a drama but shot as a horror movie. I think that's really kind of clever and gives the film like a haunting quality. And I guess with a softer kind of ending, as in it's not really a soft ending, but it's like a not really clear, unless maybe it was more clear to people than it is to me. But I feel like that kind of adds to the uncomfortableness of watching this film, because you're kind of, it's what's not said sometimes that's what is most scary. So I think this is kind of an interesting one to check out. Yeah, I would love if anyone has a different sort of interpretation about the ending. I would love to know. Let me know in the comments if you love or hate this film. I think some people I think most people found it very creepy and like eerie and kind of uncomfortable. But I do think more recently people are a bit like, see the flaws in the film more. So yeah, I'd love to know what you guys think, if you kind of have something to add. I didn't find out that much about the particular actors in this film, so as you know, I love it if you drop me some facts or thoughts in the comments. And that is The Servant from 1963.